Do you think that your child has sensory processing issues or sensory sensitivities? Well, today I'm going to be completing my three-part series on sensory integration disorder. So, in part one and two, I reviewed all the foundational components and information about what sensory integration disorder is and what you can look for in your child, all the red flag behaviors that might indicate that your child has sensory integration disorder. And today I'm going to be reviewing what other factors that overlap in terms of neurological disorders and that are components of sensory integration disorder or SID. And those other neurological deficits can be or give red flags that your child may also have deficits in vision processing as well as auditory processing. So that's what I'm going to be reviewing with you today, parents. And I'm also going to be covering just a little bit about speech and language therapy, because speech and language therapy also overlaps. And what I mean by that and overlapping is when a child has neurological disorders, other areas of the brain that encompasses the way our child learns is not just sensory. It can be auditory, it can be visual, and it can also run over into the speech and language realms. So before we move on, I want to just remind you to please leave your comments below, because I'd love to hear from you if you think your child has any of these deficits in the areas of sensory, in terms of occupational therapy, or vision or auditory processing deficits. So let's first talk about auditory, okay? So auditory processing is the way that our kids will take in auditory information. And again, this is the way that their brain modulates and processes auditory information into the brain, in which then that is going to affect the way our children learn. And if they have deficits or processing issues in the auditory system, then that's absolutely going to affect their learning in school. So if that is the case and you suspect that, then the assessment that is appropriate for auditory processing is called a central auditory processing disorder, which is CAPD assessment, which is an auditory processing assessment. This assessment is conducted by an audiologist, and they have certain battery of tests that they conduct on your child. Your child would go to the audiologist. They sit in a soundproof room. They put on these little headphones, and the audiologist would conduct the assessment, and it sounds in one ear and then the other ear, and their whole battery of tests that go along with that. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of information so you understand a little bit more about auditory processing, and if you see red flags in your child that they're exhibiting some of these behaviors, then you might know, I wonder if my child has auditory processing disorder. So when an assessment is completed for CAPD, Central Auditory Processing Disorder Assessment, your child can have two diagnoses under that. So your audiologist might identify a primary or a secondary disorder under CAPD, and those two areas would be an integration central auditory processing dysfunction or an auditory associative central auditory processing dysfunction. So those would be the two categories, because some kids have just one, some kids might have both. And in that case, the evaluator, the audiologist, would identify which one that your child is found eligible for CAPD. and that would be on your assessment on the recommendations and findings, okay? So let me explain to you what an integration deficit is. So an integration, and that would be the integration central auditory processing dysfunction category. An integration deficit involves the inability to perform tasks that require intersensory or interhemispheric communication, resulting in the inability to synthesize pieces of information into a usable whole. So their auditory processing is not working properly. Auditory symptoms of integration deficit vary widely and may include difficulty coordinating multimodal inputs. Tasks that involve multimodal inputs include note-taking, drawing a picture from verbal or written instructions, dancing to the beat of the music, singing, playing an instrument. Variable speech and noise skills is common, not because of decreased redundancy in the auditory system, but because a critical component of speech and noise skills may be affected. Variable impacts on communication, such as deficits in auditory verbal language. So now this is affecting the verbal language or the expressive language of a child. That's where it bleeds over into speech. Learning and memory, syntactic, pragmatic, and receptive language deficits may also be observed. So that's why when you get a speech and language assessment, you want to ask the speech and language evaluator, pathologist at the speech and language path, to also encompass in her report auditory processing, okay? But then you could also get a CAP assessment, but you can start with the speech and language because speech and language is very common for kids on an IEP to have a speech and language assessment conducted. So the behaviors that you may see if your child has deficits in integration in the auditory category would look like integration deficits often have difficulty knowing how to do a task and tend to watch and wait. So those kiddos will just kind of sit there and watch and look around and not know how to just start a task. So they're going to look at their peers for prompting, and they're going to maybe ask the teacher, or they're just going to sit there and wait because they're not going to know what to do. It is common for these individuals to easily become overwhelmed. They may give up or just say, I don't know, I don't get it, or I have no idea what to do. They may have difficulty with transitions. They might have difficulty getting started on moving quickly from a task to task. So they will have a problem with completing a task and then moving on to another task, transitioning. They may need more time to process information and complete their work. So that's one of those kids that need extra time to process the auditory information. Academically, they may have more difficulty with sight word recognition, spelling, writing skills, and other sensory integration tasks. So again, this auditory effect definitely is overlapping with sensory integration tasks. This is where you see in these reports how they overlap each other in terms of sensory integration, and then auditory, and then also you'll see vision overlapping as well as speech and language. So now that was the integration deficit. Now let's look at the auditory associative deficit. And that means that results are consistent with a likely auditory language deficit in these kids that are categorized by inability to apply the rules of language to incoming auditory input, perhaps more properly considered as an auditory language deficit. Communication problems may include receptive language deficits in vocabulary, semantics, and syntax. They have difficulty understanding words that have multiple meanings. They may be they have difficulty with auditory associative deficits. So those kids that have difficulty with vocabulary, they might say sentences incorrectly, they're speaking incorrectly, they're writing sentences incorrectly in terms of the syntax of the sentence or the syntax of how they speak and the semantics of the way they write and speak. Written language may be impacted with errors in punctuation, grammar, verb tense, capitalization, and they have usually they write with run-on sentences, indicating difficulty with the use of the rules of language. So some of the behaviors that are the red flags for kids that may have an auditory associative deficit look like they may often request clarification, saying, I don't know, what do you mean? I don't understand. There are often communication problems in syntax, vocabulary, semantics, verbal or written expression, pragmatics, so social communication, and foreign language acquisition. So those kids have a very difficult time taking a second language. There is sometimes trouble with math word problems. And so those are some of the things that the red flags you'll look for if you that might trigger you to ask for an auditory CAPD assessment. So now let's move on to the vision area. So vision, you're going to, a person that, an optometrist that does vision assessments is called a developmental optometrist. So you don't go to just a typical optometrist that checks your eyes to see if you have 20/20 vision or if you need glasses. No, these are specialized developmental doctors of optometry that know how to test for vision processing, developmental vision processing optometrist. Okay, and so some of those areas include that they test for are visual discrimination, visual memory, visual sequential memory, and visual closure. And so visual discrimination, these tests test the ability of an individual to notice form and detail. The skill is imperative in the decoding process for reading. And all the information is not only important in laying the foundation for visual memory, it is also important for comprehension. So these kids that have visual processing disorders, they have a very hard time learning to read. They're probably extremely far behind in grade level with their reading. And that's why, because they have vision processing deficits. Okay, now visual memory. This tests the ability to recognize previously presented material essential for comprehension during reading. Visualization is an area of need. So that's when we read, when we're reading and comprehending something we're reading, we're visualizing in our mind what we're reading, which assists in comprehension. Kids with visual processing issues, they don't visualize in their minds because they're so focused on the reading component of actually reading the words in the sentence, they're not comprehending, or they're not understanding what they're reading. Visualization is an area of need. Inconsistent visual intake interferes with formatting a reliable and consistent visual schema from which an appropriate foundation of visual knowledge can be built. Again, so they're not comprehending what they're reading. Visual spatial relationships. This tests the ability to differentiate if an object has a discrete and specific directional component unique unto itself. And so that means that the visual spatial components of what they're reading, or even doing any kind of task with, maybe they'll probably have a lot of trouble with writing. These kids, they don't write on the lines, they write little, they write big. So again, you'll probably remember I talked about that in sensory integration disorder with the fine motor. Those kids have that. It bleeds over into the vision as well. Visual form consistency. This tests the individual's ability to manipulate visual information with other meaningful areas of visual thinking and understanding. And so again, that's another area of testing that they would do. Visual sequential memory. This tests one's ability to remember visually presented material of increasing complexity and length. This task encourages chunking of visual information as its most successful intervention for remembering visual sequences. So those are the kids that need chunking. They need to, their directions and assignments and projects to be broken down into chunks, because they're not going to be able to visually remember the material and the complexity of the length of the material. They aren't able to do that, so they need chunking. And then there's another area that's called visual figure ground, which probes the ability to derive meaning when there is a myriad of other visual information or clutter on the page. They have poor visual scanning and will hamper being able to identify information in complex visual arrays. So those are the kids that need, when you hand a child an assignment that has a bunch of information and clutter on the page, they look at that and they become completely overwhelmed. They might have a behavior, they might start crying, they might have a tantrum, or they might just say, I can't do that. That's too much. I'm overwhelmed. I can't do that. I don't want to do that, because it's overwhelming their vision processing. They're modulating their visual system when they look at something that's visually overwhelming to them. Those kids need accommodations to cut down that visual information on a page. Okay, there's other areas like it's called visual closure, which tests the individual to derive meaning from visually presented information that is not complete in its form or its content. Poor visual closure will negatively impact being able to derive meaning from the bits of information presented and solidifying them into a meaningful whole. So those kids just can't take what they're looking at and then come up with a solution, or come up with a, what do I do next with this visual information? How do I comprehend this visual information? So all this has to do with the visual processing of that child having deficits in those areas. So, visual processing and auditory processing are huge components for our kiddos that have these areas of deficits that never ever get identified, that never ever get assessed, because most parents don't even know they can ask for a vision processing assessment or an auditory processing assessment. So how do you get that from your school district? Because if you just come right out and say, I want a vision assessment and an auditory processing assessment, the district's going to go, well, why? And what kind of evidence do you have to ask for that? So this is how you get it. So when you have an occupational therapy or speech and language therapy assessment, you're going to want to ask for IEEs in both those areas. And why? Because district speech and OT assessments are never going to recommend a vision processing or an auditory processing assessment, because that's not what they do. You're going to have to get that information from an IEE in occupational therapy or an IEE in speech and language therapy. And remember, an IEE is an independent educational evaluation. That is an assessment done from a private agency that is not a district employee. So it's a private speech and language pathologist and a private occupational therapist that has qualifications in sensory integration disorder, and they are going to see those deficits in vision or auditory, and they are going to recommend in their recommendations, I see deficits in vision, I see deficits in auditory, and I recommend that this child be granted a vision assessment or an auditory assessment or both. So that's how you get the evidence to ask the district to fund a CAPD, Central Auditory Processing Disorder Assessment, or a vision processing assessment. And then also remember, in the area of speech and language, when you get the IEE, you absolutely want to ask the IEE provider for speech that you want that assessment to include areas of auditory processing, because speech and language, the discipline of speech and language also encompasses the areas of auditory processing as well as assistive technology. You can also ask that speech and language IEE pathologist to screen for the areas of assistive technology to see if your child needs assistive technology to assist them in their learning. So those are super important for parents to know, those other areas and how all those neurological deficits overlap one another. And most kids, you don't just have one area of deficit. You're typically going to see areas of deficits in all those other components of the neurological, the way the brain works, and those deficits. And getting those deficits addressed through assessment, and then having goals developed and accommodations developed and services developed, because an audiologist will recommend specific services, audiology programs, specific goals, specific accommodations, as well as a vision processing optometrist, a developmental optometrist will recommend vision therapy. And these things really do work when your child finally gets what they need and these deficits addressed through therapy by an outside provider, a non-public agency. So parents, I hope that you gained a lot of new knowledge with that information. Please like and share this video so other parents can also get this information. And if you would like more information on these areas of occupational therapy for sensory integration disorder, vision processing, auditory processing, and speech and language in terms of auditory processing, then please join my Special Education Parent Empowerment Network Facebook group. It's a private Facebook group just for parents that you can communicate with me, ask questions with me, and I can give you additional coaching and consulting on these areas so that you can get the assessments that your child needs in order to have their needs met. And so I'm Valerie Abrahamian, the IEP navigator, and I help, assist, and coach parents to get the IEP their child needs to thrive, both in school and in life after high school. And I hope to see you next Monday at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time for my next Facebook Live. Take care, everyone, and God bless.